Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian, and we are at the Army-Navy Country Club in Arlington, Virginia, to talk to Jonathan Ward, who is a PhD student at Oxford University, but you're also part of the Changing Character of War program there, and you're an expert on the Indian Ocean. You were the Fall Naval Submarine League just held its fall lecture. You were the featured speaker. When Americans and folks in the Pentagon have a tendency of thinking about the world, they have a tendency of thinking of the Russians, and in Europe in a Mediterranean context, and then they have a tendency of thinking about China and the South and East China Seas. But there's this titanic body of water called the Indian Ocean that folks have a tendency of sometimes missing. Tell us why this region is so strategically important writ large, but also specifically for the United States.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vago. Very glad to be here. And the key thing about the Indian Ocean, the most important thing you really need to know is that China depends on it for just about everything. China's economic rise at this point, their resources, their trade, their energy flow is all essentially coming out of the Middle East. Even from Europe, it has to transit the Indian Ocean. From the Persian Gulf, from East Africa, from West Africa, even coming around the Indian Ocean to the point that 60% of their oil supply, more than that really, is coming across the Indian Ocean. So vast body of water. And then there's another piece of it, which the Chinese call the Malacca dilemma. So you essentially have to get China's entire economic lifeline through a body of water, a channel of water that at its narrowest is 2 miles wide. So for Chinese strategic planners, for Chinese government, for really everybody, for the military, one of the key questions really existentially is how do we deal with this geography? How do we deal with the fact that we're dependent on this body of water?
In terms of the dynamics, and I want to get to the Straits of Malacca in a moment, obviously that's the reason why Singapore is so important to us and why China is always pressuring Singapore, forcing Singapore to sort of ride that wire fence all the time. But in terms of China, what's China doing in the Indian Ocean? Because we have a tendency of looking at what China is doing, for example, in the island bases that it's building in the South China Sea, what our expectations are going to happen in the East China Sea. But what's China doing, and what are the dynamics with India that are happening in the Indian Ocean?
Got you. So as far as China's presence in the Indian Ocean, this is what's they're very active. What's called One Belt, One Road, which is essentially an infrastructure and development project that's meant to link essentially Africa, Eurasia, and the Indian Ocean region back to China in support of Chinese trade flows, in support of energy resources, all of this. So the Maritime Silk Road is the Indian Ocean component, and that involves China building deep water ports in Bangladesh, Gwadar, and Pakistan. They're currently expanding Colombo in Sri Lanka, Colombo's deep water port. You also have ports along the East African coast. This is a major piece of it. And you also have, for the first time, China's first overseas military base, which was opened in Djibouti this year. So when we look at the South China Sea, and we're very focused on that and sort of China's near sea activity in the East China and the South China Seas, again, we have to remember the dependency here. And what you really have is China that's dependent on the sea line of communication going from the Persian Gulf through, across India, below India and through Malacca back to China. And of course, Japan and South Korea and others also depend on this sort of sea line. Now, what that means, I think, is as much as we focus on the South China Sea, we have to consider the South China Sea itself as part of an Indian Ocean picture. I was with the head of a Chinese think tank in 2014, and he was telling me, look, this is, for us, the most important region in the world is the Indian Ocean because we're going to depend on it for the next 30 or 40 years. So again, it's you have the trade, you have the energy and resources, and then you have the infrastructure projects that they're using a great deal of diplomacy and also financing to back up. But then you also have the military infrastructure, which is beginning to emerge. So when you have the South China Sea and the island building that's going on there, and then of course you have the Djibouti naval base, which on one hand is to support Chinese participation in anti-piracy operations, but really two of China's most their activity in the South China Sea is one end of the Indian Ocean, and Djibouti is the other. And this is, again, it's very clearly what they depend on are these routes.
Well, and in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, right, is a key part of the whole One Belt, One Road to be able to underwrite infrastructure projects regionally. And obviously in Djibouti, the United States uses that as a base. France uses it as a base as well, which makes for very interesting bedfellows in a very, very small space. But when it comes to India, has a tendency of looking at the Indian Ocean as that's our backyard. You know, that's our sea space. And India has been also on a naval build-up and naval modernization program. What are some of the tensions that exist there? Because if you talk to Indian leaders, you know, we in Washington or the public has a tendency of thinking, well, it's India and Pakistan, whereas the Indians spend no time thinking about Pakistan at all.
Well, I think China and India have a very interesting history, which is, of course, when the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949 and India, gained independence in 1947, the two nations basically came out and said, we're going to be brothers. We have a history of brotherhood. Nehru was talking about brothers of 1,000 years. When Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, stepped off the plane in Delhi in 1954, it was Hindi, Chini, bye bye, China and India are brothers. And then 8 years later, they're fighting a war in the Himalayas. So you basically you're going from Bandung to from brotherhood to border war within a decade. And this is a major sort of piece of, I would say, their current relationship is affected by this past. What you have now, China's been concerned about U.S. encirclement going back to the 1950s. I mean, really with our bases in Japan and South Korea, our relationship with Taiwan. And the Chinese were also very concerned about the possibility of India winding up in defense arrangements with the United States in that era, wherein, of course, India was not aligned. And now India, conversely, what China calls one belt, one road, building various ports around the Indian Ocean, Indian defense analysts have long been concerned about what they call the string of pearls, which is, again, encirclement by China. So when you have Chinese ports, let's say, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, possibly in Sri Lanka, and you have had, in 2014, you had a Chinese submarine that docked in Colombo, at the Colombo port. You have a Chinese submarine that docked in Karachi. So these are issues for India in the same way that China looks at us as a sort of encircling them and something that's been a problem on their mind for decades. In India, you have a similar question of just what are China's intentions here as they build up all this infrastructure, which on the one hand is sort of necessary, as China would see it, to just maintaining the security of their own resource and trade dependencies, their economic lifelines. On the other hand, you're transiting a country who India is very naturally an Indian Ocean country, of course. I mean, geographically they spill right out into the region. And that is very much something that India considers its primary area of interest, especially in naval doctrine. So you're transiting a major rising nation with whom relations essentially fell apart in the 50s and 60s. Now, an analyst at a Chinese think tank told me, which I thought was interesting, you in the United States think of us as a rising nation. We think of India as the rising nation.
What we haven't discussed yet is Russia, which has a very complex, history with both countries. Right, when India was an online country, it was actually Russia was its #1 arms supplier. Even until recently, the whole rapprochement and getting closer to the United States was in part, hey, these systems aren't as reliable. We want to go much more first world in our capabilities, get closer to the United States. Obviously, there's a strategic military dynamic there. I mean, I think China, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you. From that standpoint, that was a key axis that President Bush was fostering with India and India with the United States, in part because of concerns over China. What about Russia's relationship with China? In the Cold War, it was contentious, but it has been of a different character over the past decade or so.
Absolutely. I think that it's something that I would tend to hear people underestimating that relationship. And a lot of people would say that because of the Sino-Soviet split and those sorts of dynamics, we shouldn't be too concerned with Russia and China staying together for too long, because in the end they won't stay together. I think that's an underestimation. It was a very different relationship back then. I mean, what you had, the best scholarship on the Sino-Soviet split basically says that China was not content to be a junior partner to the USSR. I mean, they were not a superpower. It was the Soviet Union that was the superpower. And now you sort of have an inverse of this, where China's the $12 trillion economy, Russia's a $2 trillion economy. On the other hand, I think that the level of sort of military cooperation, I mean, to have just, last month in September, you had Russia-China drills in the South China Sea, which emphasized anti-submarine warfare, island seizure, etc. Last year, you had Russia-China drills in, I believe, in the Sea of Japan, where they were doing landing exercises and what have you. I mean, there's certainly, as Russia operates does what it's doing in the Ukraine, and as China does what it's doing in the South China Sea. And there, I mean, there are some conversations going on that I'm sure are very interesting. And I don't think we should underestimate it, chiefly because China, while it doesn't have alliances the way that we do, I think they get a great deal of value out of their partnerships by way of providing military offset to other nations. I mean, to be what they're doing now is supplying Pakistan with 8 diesel-electric submarines. So 4 will be built in Karachi and 4 will be built in China. This is, I think, Pakistan's first significant submarine capability. And that very clearly has to do with India and the Indian Ocean. And then for us to have so many problems with Russia right now, I just imagine there's some interesting conversation going on in Moscow and Beijing on that. I also think that because of India's long-standing defense relationship with Russia, and of course they were Russia's partner, treaty ally from 1971 through during the Soviet period, after the Kennedy administration had looked towards India for this, possibly getting together as partners or allies during the border war, that fell apart and they went to the USSR. But I think because of that long-standing relationship between India and Russia, I think that potentially offers interesting back channels to Russia should we want to, approach that relationship differently. I think India and Russia is an interesting dynamic.
But it also presents a potentially catastrophic situation where, things can escalate, not just in the South and East China Seas, where there's a concern over a whole, right, I mean, that entire region is set on edge, in part because of China's aggressive behavior. The Indians are on edge because they're looking at what China is doing over there, and they don't want to see it in their backyard, and they do start to see that, right, with, historically with Pakistan, or looking at it, for example, from a Sri Lankan standpoint, again, right in the Indian backyard. What kind of strategic thinking does the United States need to use, do you think? Is it good enough just to get close to India, or should the United States, which seems to be the extent of it, whether it's through naval or military cooperation and arms sales, but does there need to be a different sort of strategic approach regionally the United States should be taking in the Indian Ocean if it wants to shore up strategic alliances to create a more deterrent posture, so that China, as it looks to the South China Sea and says, hey, I might not be able to get away with anything there, does the same thing when it looks at the Indian Ocean, for example?
I think, first of all, we have to recognize that India, is going to their objective is to have a 200-ship navy by 2027. The cooperation that's going on between India and the United States and Japan is very significant. In a sense, with or without us. I mean, this is their primary concern. I mean, that is, they're 90% dependent on maritime trade. They have long considered themselves maritime first responders in the region. I think to bring all these relationships together is great for everybody. I think the thing that we might be leaving out a little bit is the Europeans. I think, I guess it was with Macmillan when the UK decided everything east of Suez is going to matter less to us now. It would probably be better to have more British engagement in this sort of rising, let's say, grouping of democratic countries that are talking about maritime security. And I think also the French are very interesting. I mean, they are, of course, have Réunion in the southern Indian Ocean as an overseas territory. They're very diplomatically knowledgeable and active in the island nations of the Indian Ocean region. I think we should not forget the Europeans as well. And then I'd be curious to see where things go with Russia by the time India and Russian relations sort of have their own dynamic. And then with China, I think we have to recognize that this is, just to keep the whole thing going. I mean, they are completely dependent on these sea lanes, on the Indian Ocean region. So for them, it's a necessity and an inevitability. And how we manage that, I think, is by bringing in as many friends and partners as we can to sort of come up with a stability concept.
The British, obviously, with their 2 big deck aircraft carriers that are coming into service, the Queen Elizabeth and the Prince of Wales, British officials don't waste time telling you that most of their time is going to be spent, in the neighborhood. Certainly, I mean, there's the base that's being built in Bahrain. There's talk of another base further east, whether it's the ships spend more time, for example, in Singapore and elsewhere. Because there are a lot of folks in Europe who recognize that in the event of a shooting war between, China and Japan, America goes in on the part of its treaty ally, and then Article 5 gets triggered, and then all of a sudden Europeans are sitting, in a Pacific War, going, "Wow, how did we end up there?" Um, let's talk briefly about the Malacca Straits of Malacca. Obviously, Singapore has been a strategic partner and ally of the United States for a long time since its independence from Malaysia. Um, there's the Changi naval base, which is big enough to accommodate U.S. aircraft carriers. Submarines regularly go through there. And at the same time, the Singaporeans are the ones who urge the United States be more vocal about China, and the one who tells the United States, okay, quiet down a little bit on the China rhetoric. What's the dynamic there? Because there are some people in Washington who will tell you, look, 70% ethnically Han Chinese. You meet a Singaporean cab driver. He owns property now in China, for example, in the towns where some of these nationalist Chinese ended up there in the first place. What's the dynamic? How pivotal is it? And what lengths do you think China is willing to go to secure the Strait of Malacca? And does that include, for example, a co-option or other means, pressure? I'll let you use your own adjectives for this, to sort of compel the three nations that have equities in that region, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, to either open or to constrict trade and travel through that area.
Got you. I haven't spent enough time in Singapore, to answer that in good depth. I mean, I was on a cargo ship from the Riau off the coast of Singapore to Borneo as a 23-year-old back in the day across the South China Sea.
That's awesome.
Thank you. It was it was very interesting, a lot of fun. But so I've been out. I would want to have new conversations to understand that better. But I would say, Singapore is obviously emblematic of what the sort of peace and stability of the Asian sea lanes has brought. I mean, it's a system, and I think there are many nations in Asia that have reaped such great benefits. I mean, not least of which is China as well. That I think managing that sort of dynamic between the prosperity we've all enjoyed for decades in Asia, and the rise of a new power. And a rise that is increasingly carrying with it a military dimension. These are the major questions, and I think for some of the Southeast Asian nations, I mean, being in the midst of that is something I'd like to learn a lot more about.
Jonathan, thanks very, very much, and best of luck on your studies. And if you ever find yourself back over here, let us know.
Thank you very much.